Well, welcome everybody to this final webinar of this calendar year. We wanted to just celebrate the end of the year by highlighting some upcoming cadio events. Spring 2024, we're going to be continuing our webinar series and kicking it off with Danielle, who is on.
Yay!
Yay! We also had a lot of success getting a really great large group of people for our January 24 training. So thanks to any of you who helped us spread the word about that. You can look for our next one in May if you are connected with anybody who might be interested. Applications for that one are opening in February. And then just a little highlighting of some conferences cadio will be at. We'll be at the DNI conference in DC next week. March will be at SBM and at SRNT.
Do you want to say what SBM stands for?
Society for Behavioral Medicine. And SRNT is the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco.
Yeah.
And then ISRI in June is the International Society for Research on Internet Interventions.
Yes, that was just all a test.
Yeah. Various collections of us will be there, so if any of you will be there as well, we would of course love to connect with you. So today, the purpose of today's webinar is to pose questions, receive answers to questions, engage in discussion about big questions. And we really want to emphasize that this is something we're hoping people will engage in whatever way you'd like to. We're also going to start with a poll. And this is a new thing we're trying. So at the end, you might let us know whether you liked this. But the poll has two parts you'll see in a moment. The first part provides a list of some of our most frequently asked questions. And if you see a question on there that you're hoping we'll address during our time today, please select it. And you can select as many as you would like. That'll just help us give a sense of, or get a sense of the priorities. But also the poll provides a spot where you can input an anonymous question if you prefer to do, provide a question that way. And remember, all questions are good questions. We're open to super tricky questions, elementary questions, and everything in between. So I think we'll launch the poll. As we wrap up, and as a great reveal to everybody on the webinar, there's a lot of interest in power, a lot of interest in the optimization objective, what it is, how do I pick one? A lot of interest in how can I get preparation phase work funded. Those are sort of the top three that are jumping out at me. We also have received some other questions. So I'm going to kick us off with power. We can start with a big one. One posed question is, how do we know the required sample size? And on a sort of related note, one of the most selected poll questions is, how am I supposed to do a power analysis for an optimization randomized control trial if there's no literature indicating what effect size I can expect for main effects? So who would like to launch us off in the discussion of power?
Well, that question about how am I supposed to do a power analysis if there's no literature, that question comes up in a lot of contexts other than most. That's, for better or worse, not really a most question, although it's certainly relevant here. Not saying it isn't, but I don't know if that gives you comfort or just makes it that much more frustrating, but that is a very, very common question about power. And you know what? Very often, even if the literature does suggest what effect size you can expect, which it hardly ever does in any field actually, that even isn't that helpful a lot of the time. So you're almost always kind of in the dark with power analysis. But one thing I want to say about intervention optimization is you can think of, if you're thinking more in a decision priority rather than conclusion priority framework, you can think of what is the smallest main effect I would want to see in a component that I would include in the intervention. And that can then become the effect size that you power for, because if in reality the effect size is less, you might not have enough power to detect it, but that's okay because you don't care what it is at that point. All you want to know is whether the main effect is above this certain threshold level that you're interested in.
And I think that sometimes, I mean, that answer is not specific to most, right?
Well, it's specific to any time you'd be in the decision priority rather than conclusion priority mode.
But I think that the typical fellow intervention scientist sometimes feels uncomfortable when we give that answer, because they're like, well, what do I know? Like, how should I say what to pick as the smallest effect size? And I think, again, that's not a uniquely most thing, but what would you say in that conversation?
What I've said to people a number of times is, think about what effect you would want the package to have. You know, what's a reasonable effect size for the package? And then think about how many candidate components you have. They're not all gonna hit. So let's say you're examining 5 candidate components, and maybe you expect, perhaps a bit optimistically, but 3 of them would have a detectable effect. Then take the total effect that you want the package to have, divide that by 3, but then add a little bit, because there's going to be probably some antagonistic interactions between the components. That's not at all unusual. So that is to say, the effect of the package is probably going to be a bit less than just the sum of the main effects. But that'll give you a good rough rule of thumb. I think people should relax a bit about power analysis, because it's not a precision operation, power analysis at all. You have to make certain assumptions. You're always operating in the dark. Again, I don't know if that makes you feel better or worse, but that's how it is.
But I think it raises like another area where sometimes folks feel uncomfortable, especially like if we are taking a package that has been tested and said to be effective, and we're breaking it apart into components, coming up with a reasonable estimate like can feel really tricky. But like, I'm always like, just enjoy that discomfort. You get to leave the science.
Yeah, no, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I mean, that if you're gonna work in most, you kind of have to, that kind of has to be your mantra. But now, if you had effect size estimates for the package from previous work, actually that would give you quite a bit to go on, I would think, for the power analysis, for the optimization trial.
Yeah. And of course, as we said, if that's not a sufficient coverage of power and you have follow-up questions to power, let us know. But I think in the meantime, we can move on to the question, yes.
Well, what about the question, how do we know the required sample size?
Yes, we should probably touch on that more.
Go ahead.
You can do that.
Well, you do a power analysis. But when you do the power analysis, you should relax and you should get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Have a glass of wine while you're doing the power analysis.
Make it a party.
That's right.
Yeah, so as far as how we know the required sample size, Cadio does have some resources on the website. There are also some good sources of information that have been written about in various places, but power analysis is a little bit different depending on what kind of optimization trial design you might be using. But there's a lot on Cadio's website typically when we're talking about powering for a 2 to the k factorial experiment, it's a matter of thinking about the sort of magnitude of the main effect that we might be hoping to detect. But as Linda alluded to before, in the optimization phase, we're frequently using a decision priority perspective, which sometimes means while we're relaxing a bit about power analysis generally, we sometimes loosen some of the expectations that in other areas of scientific inquiry are a little rigid, like for example, an alpha level cutoff. Sometimes from a decision priority perspective, it might be justified to loosen that up a bit. But we also have a great R package and SAS macro that helps with doing that sort of a power analysis, and then from that determining the required sample size.
Sometimes people do this sample size calculation using G-power. And can you just talk about maybe some of the assumptions that are not the differences? I'm thinking specifically about effect coding.
Yes.
Like what if I did this in G-power, didn't use the SAS macro or the R package, what are some of the considerations? Is it gonna be exactly the same?
Yes. Now I cannot speak authoritatively to whether it's possible to set things in G-power such that you can get at something exactly what we would provide in the R package or the SAS macro. I don't know enough about that, so I wouldn't promise anything. However, I will say that when people are really used to using G-power, I still recommend using the R package or the macro, because there can be really subtle differences. In particular, when you're going about analyses using effect coding versus when you're using dummy coding, it can throw things off, and it also can throw things off in a way that are not always super apparent when you're using these sorts of packages, which is one of the reasons I recommend that people try the R package. And it might sound intimidating, but one of the nice things is there's great documentation for that R package. So even if you don't use R routinely for other purposes, it's relatively easy to just get into using it specifically for that purpose.
And I think because I am the sassy one, I think SAS is pretty similar in that regard with the documentation that we have available.
Yeah, so I guess one thing I would recommend is if you work with a biostatistician, maybe you can share that resource with the biostatistician, and he or she can kind of get used to doing power analysis this way.
So I don't know if this question was upvoted, but what happens very quickly for me in these consultations or conversations is the question about power for interactions. And would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So I'm talking now about the 2 to the k factorial experiment, which is a very common type of optimization trial design. In a in a perfectly balanced 2 to the k factorial experiment, so you have equal ends, you have the same power to detect a regression coefficient of a particular size, whether that regression coefficient corresponds to a main effect or an interaction of any order. So that means that means that if you define the interaction as the regression coefficient, you have the same power for detection of interactions as you have for detection of main effects. Now, it turns out there are different ways to define the interaction. And there's a lot of confusion about this because people are using that word interaction, but some people are talking about one definition and some people are talking about a different definition. I could spend the rest of our time today talking about this. I refer you to chapter 4 of my book, where that is all explained. But I also could recommend, if you don't wanna go to all that trouble, just in your work, define the interaction as the regression coefficient. And that is one of the beauties of the 2 to the k and efficiencies of the 2 to the k factorial experiment, that it has equal power across the board if the experiment is perfectly balanced, and approximately equal power if it's not perfectly balanced. Things are more complicated with other kinds of designs, if it's if even one of the factors has 3 or more levels, or if you're talking about a smart, things would be a bit different.
Any updates on the Coursera course for biostatisticians?
Yes, thank you for asking that. We are very close to, actually, Gabby, you can probably answer that question. Where are we with the Coursera course for biostatisticians? We're very close on that, right?
Yeah. It should be up within the next semester.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
We don't have an exact, date that we'd be able to give you for that right now, but you'll definitely get an email. We'll post it on Twitter, send it out via our newsletter when the course is going to be available.
Yeah, it'll definitely be available before the end of the spring semester, and I'm really hoping, we're actively working on it. Everything's recorded. We're at the point where we're going through and just correcting small errors. So I'm hoping that it will be up more like the middle of the semester, but I think we can promise it for sure by the end of the semester. And I'm glad you're asking about that. So those of you who may not know that we are working on that, I think many of you are familiar with our Coursera course that provides an introduction, kind of a comprehensive introduction to most. We have been working on the second course that Danielle mentioned, that is aimed, it covers much of the same material, but it's aimed at biostatisticians and statisticians. So if you are working with a biostatistician and the person would like some additional background so they can be maybe be a more effective collaborator for people who are working in the most area, that you can send the person to that course.
Great. Okay, so if there are remaining questions about power, feel free to put them in the chat, but let's move on now to the optimization objective. What is it? How do I pick one? Another big question. We've started with the biggest ones. Power is a big thing. The optimization objective is the big thing.
Yeah.
Of course, a sort of simple answer to the question is that the optimization objective really operationalizes the goal of the optimization process. So it might be a matter of, for example, trying to identify the intervention that's associated with the best expected outcome, but deliverable for less than $500. It could incorporate cost in dollars, it could incorporate cost in time, it could just be a matter of trying to identify the intervention that is associated with the best expected outcome. It could also incorporate multiple outcomes, potentially. So this is an area where the possibilities are as wide as the goals of public health, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes it hard for us to say the optimization objective is this certain thing, because it's kind of a broad concept. And by the way, that term optimization objective, we used to call it optimization criterion, and you can still use that term if you want to, it's not wrong. But we started calling it the optimization objective because, to be honest, the word criterion, I found it kind of freaked out a lot of intervention scientists. They thought it was like a super technical thing. So we changed it to objective, which is a little bit more intuitive, I think. So you remember the concept of intervention ease, right? So we're balancing effectiveness, affordability, scalability, and efficiency. And the optimization objective is really just getting really specific about that, about what you think is more important. Are all of those considerations going to be in there, or maybe only some of them? So that you have to you have to operationalize all that, and that's what the optimization objective is doing.
Linda, there's a follow-up question in the chat. Does that also include accounting for social and or political costs?
It can, but of course you have to be able to quantify it in some way. But yes, really, I would say any kind of cost can be in there.
So, two things I wanted to say about this. One is I like the flip to optimization objective because I think it makes it a lot clearer, the distinction between the optimization objective and the definition of a important effect for the decision-making process. I have seen a lot of times where we conflate those
Yes.
two things and they're different. Right, but the other question that I think happens really quickly is like, I don't know, where do I even find this out? And like, I love that question because that's like, could be a whole aim, right? Like you could do your optimization trial and use the all active components optimization objective, but then collect a bunch of data from those interested parties to figure out like moving forward, how much money or how much time or whatever other metric comes into play. And like you could do that concurrently with an optimization trial, or that could be part of your preparation phase work as well.
Yeah. If you look at that flow chart of MOST that shows kind of like what you do in each of the phases of MOST, we have identification of the optimization objective in the preparation phase. And the reason it's there is because we want to make sure that people then, when they conduct the optimization trial, collect the data they need. So for example, if your optimization objective is the best combination of components that are the most effective combination of components we can get for less than $500 a person, well, you want to make sure you're collecting data on cost, right? Because otherwise you won't be able to really use that optimization objective. So that's the reason for selecting it in the preparation phase. But you can use the same trial results to optimize using different optimization objectives if you want to. If things change, or maybe you're optimizing for, maybe you're interested in identifying several different versions of an intervention for several different contexts. You could use several different optimization objectives. Again, you just have to have the data you need to do that.
Can you also, I think both of you, speak a little bit about an optimization objective that is extra loaded? So it's like for $500 delivered within 30 minutes or less, and what you would do in that situation or how you would advise somebody?
So are you talking about the case where we want one that's cost effective and the best use of time and this and that? Yeah, one of the big challenges in determining an optimization objective is really identifying sort of the main constraint, if you will, or the most limiting constraint. Of course, if everything is equally limiting, it is possible to apply those sorts of many constraints with the understanding that you might not be winding up with the most effective intervention. But I think that there's one further little nuance to your question as well of sometimes we have to be really careful with the wording of optimization objectives, because there might be a tendency to say the objective is to identify the most effective intervention that's cost effective and this or that. And sometimes there are little contradictions in some of the constraints that we're talking about where it can't be all of the above. So it's one of the reasons identifying an objective is challenging.
Yeah, I just was reviewing specific aims for someone who had said, we're going to identify the intervention that's the most effective and the least costly and takes the least amount of time, something like that. And my comment was, you don't get all of those, and that's not really what this is about. It's about balancing those different considerations. You can include all of those ideas in the optimization, but optimization is all about balancing those different criteria.
Also, I think what you just said is a great example of what I was thinking about contradictions, because the most effective intervention and the least costly are not going to be the same.
They're almost never the same,
Almost never
unfortunately,
the
yeah.
same. And that way of stating the optimization objective doesn't communicate what will be done next. So if you can't have the most effective one and the least costly one as the choice, what do you do?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work for the past few years, led by Jillian, on decision-making. There's a lot more to do there.
Yeah, and I want to highlight this other question that a number of people endorsed. To incorporate cost as a constraint, do I need to know a precise budget for implementation? That's a really big one. Of course, if we do know a precise budget for implementation that's relevant for later implementation of the intervention, that helps a lot. But the important answer to this question is no, because as the key thing, as Linda was emphasizing before, is to just collect really good data about cost. Because even with really good data about cost, and it can be as simple as just how much it costs to deliver each different version of an intervention. It can also be more complicated if there are social or political costs that are really relevant. But with that good data, it's possible to do the sort of balancing we were alluding to before, where, for example, you might find that there are two versions of the intervention that are performing rather similarly, but one is considerably less costly than the other. And that can be a really useful way of incorporating some consideration of cost into the process, even without a clear budget.
Kate, this is fun because I'm using this as time too to hear you talk. So everyone should feel free to do the same. But Linda, to the best of my knowledge, I have not encountered someone who has run an optimization trial and used an optimization objective that helps inform the continual optimization kind of process.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that, or do you have thoughts about how someone might do that?
I think the closest, let me back up and say, I think what you're talking about, Kate, is where someone conducts an optimization trial and then optimizes the intervention, but then now knows what the weak points are and goes back and conducts another optimization trial. The closest to that would be, I guess, the work we did with the NIAAA funded study with David Wyrick and the other collaborators. And then the work of the people at C-Tree and smoking cessation, because we are now on our third round of funding and we've been using most all along the way. But they have a very broad perspective on smoking cessation, and it hasn't really been so much, this follows directly on the previous optimization trial. It's been more, work that's been done in the field and work that's been done, scientific work that's been done now suggests we should try these other things. It's been a little bit more like that rather than continual optimization.
I think the next question that I want to make sure we addressed, what are the criteria for including components in an optimization trial? And another question, what makes a good component? Good in the sense that it is testable and a factorial design. I'm looking at Kate with Kate's great expertise in conceptual models and preparation phase work. And before we get into this question in a big way, I also want to throw out there that there's a question about resources for practical guidance on robust preparation phase activities. And also interest in how we can get preparation work funded. So a broad set of preparation phase questions.
I'm not sure which one to start with.
Yeah.
But maybe the first one, I mean, this is my order here in my thinking, like where do the components come from? What is a good component and how do I fund it? Where do components come from? Well, theory, literature, your brain, clinical practice, gray literature, wherever, right? And what makes them, oh, Siri wants to be involved in this. This happened yesterday, but what makes them good is, I don't know, but like that they are distinguished from the other components that you're gonna try to put them with. So I have one of my students on the webinar, but yesterday in our class, they designed optimization trials from the conceptual models that they built. And so you do this work, you identify your components, and then you turn it into the experiment and you find where your thinking has to change, right? Because you realize that in order to get factor B, factor A has to be there or can't be distinguished or separated from something else. And so there is this kind of like, at that point, conversation between the experimental design and your conceptual model, which was super fun. You watched this happen.
Yes, I did. It was great.
I think that there is this evolution of the conceptual model to the experimental design, and then you got to figure out how to fund and maybe develop or adapt or refine parts of your component. And so maybe we can all broadly talk about ways that we have seen preparation phase get funded, but the big answer is it depends. So I think that we've got some folks on the webinar today who are using a K award to develop components and the intervention that they could then, so a career development award that they could use moving forward in their career. So that's obviously a great option, but not available if you can't get a K. So internal funding, I think, is probably the most common that I have seen from collaborators. And there are folks who will do the R21 or R34 more development, smaller scale grants. But very honestly, I've run into more project officers who are like, well, but that's not most. And so there is this kind of like interesting balance about how you pitch most and the preparation phase. And so that's a whole other conversation, maybe about grant writing and grantsmanship. Other ways that we have seen preparation phase work get funded, I don't know.
I think what you said pretty much covered it. Pilot funding or K awards, R34s, those are the main ways, and you are much stronger going in for an R01 if you have a well-developed conceptual model and you've done a pilot test of the optimization trial.
I think that, so I went in for an R01 where the first aim was to adapt components and then aim 2 was to test it, and they hated it because they wanted it to be already finished. And so I just wanted to share that to emphasize the point you made. Shoot, there was something else that came up while you were saying that.
Did Matt Lee have something that he put in the chat?
Yeah, there was an interesting question about tracking and documenting in the continual optimization process. So in particular, whether modifications or different adaptations are made to any of the core components or core functions that then would make it difficult to recognize the original intervention. Sort of, I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is the idea that continual optimization might need its own sort of documentation process.
are there other adaptation frameworks that are better suited to use with most? I don't know. I have to say, that's a great question, Matt, and I think it's kind of an open area. We talked a little bit before, continual optimization at this point is more an idea than something that people have actually done, to be honest. So, I mean, I would love to see more about how you should document that. Certainly, if you make a change now I'm assuming that by the core here, are you talking about the constant components? You have a set of constant components that you're not experimenting with, and those constant components in an optimization trial could be either components that previously have been tested and you're satisfied with, so you know they're going to go into the intervention, or could be components that you know are going to go into the intervention because they're either already the standard of care, or they're logically needed as a platform, like in drug abuse prevention interventions, very often a component that has to do with like education about drugs and their effects very often would go into that part of things, the constant component. If you make any changes in those, it's kind of an empirical question whether that has an effect on any potential interactions with the rest of the components, and you don't know because you haven't experimented on those.
One other one, so Danielle, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but one that I've seen come up a lot in grant proposals right now is the Adapt It framework. Lots of people pitching to incorporate that into the preparation phase. I don't know if that's been successful yet, but
yeah, I've tried to use it in a grant to adapt a program for patients with spinal cord injuries. We haven't had success getting it funded yet, but I think we haven't had reviewers dislike that framework. That's never been something they called out.
Yeah.
And I think that is more useful for like guiding adaptations, like when you're in the process of like, I'm going to be making adaptations. This is a very effortful thing.
Yeah.
Whereas frame IS is more for like, if adaptations are happening as you're conducting the trial, you just want to capture them in real time. And it's more of a documentation process of capturing them. They're not necessarily like guiding the adaptations that are being made though.
Okay, that's good. That's helpful distinction. And thanks, Matt, for adding that. I will say, and I think Danielle and I have talked about this before, but I think that there's plenty of room to lead the integration of those types of frameworks with the preparation phase of most. So similar to the work we have done incorporating CBPR with the preparation phase or later phases, same thing with human-centered design. Like, I think that behavior change wheel, like I think that there's opportunity to be a little bit more instructive about how they could be, synergistic, Linda. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say there. And then do you want to share Carly's experience?
Oh yeah, Carly says that she had a very frustrating experience pitching most preparation work in the NHLBI R34 mechanism as a cautionary note. I don't know if you want to say anything more about your experience, Carly. Hi.
Hi, yeah, I've told Linda about this, but I'll just add that the R34 mechanism through NHLBI is really, really carefully worded and focused on the very last steps needed to prepare for a randomized clinical trial. So I, carefully thought through, wrote, submitted my grant, and they came back to say that the most optimization phase is not a randomized clinical trial. And thus my grant was inappropriate for the mechanism. So,
Carly, was that recently?
Yeah, pretty recently.
That's disappointing.
I think don't quote me, time is a construct I'm not participating in, but I think I got those reviews back in like February or so.
Well, that's interesting. So then if an optimization trial is not an RCT, then I guess it doesn't have to follow the rules that they set down for clinical trials, right? So I guess we could, if it says clinical trial not allowed, no problem if you want to propose an optimization trial. I mean, that would follow logically from that, wouldn't it?
I mean, I agree with you. It seems logic was sort of thrown out the window. So Linda and I had kind of talked about like even just the ways to discuss what the optimization trial research is and you know, pitching it as a randomized optimization experiment, or you know, Linda had a lot of other great suggestions for that language, but I just wanted to share it as it was really frustrating because I feel like it was something that I could have addressed and gotten possibly much better reviewer feedback on with just like a tailoring of that language. And I had numerous conversations with my PO prior to submitting, as well as somebody who used to sit on that study section. So I mean, I felt like I had really done my homework, but was kind of blindsided by that point. But it was something that like maybe I had been more competitive if just that one thing had been something I had done differently. So
yeah, I just want to
Throw it
comment that I don't know if this is helpful, but a little while ago, and I don't know whether you I don't remember, Carly, whether you used this language in your application, but we started calling optimization trials optimization randomized clinical trials, or OR. So we now draw a distinction between an evaluation RCT and an optimization RCT, because NIH does consider optimization trials randomized clinical trials.
yeah, that was not the language that I used, and I think that that distinction alone would have made a really big difference. But so just for other folks who are reading different funding opportunities, just like a word to the wise to be really careful about the language that's being used as what the grant mechanism is intended for. And that's something that like in the future, I'd probably run by the PO to really make sure that that's not going to be a problem.
Jen Jen Cantrell.
Well, I had like the opposite experience, so it's just interesting to hear that I had proposed, this was several years ago, so earlier, but or a few years ago, a traditional randomized controlled trial for a study for an R34. It was for a different institute, not NHLBI. But the feedback I got was, you should turn this into a most optimization trial. So it seemed to the optimization trial as an RCT seemed to align just fine with the R34 mechanism in that case. So I don't know, it just seems to me more just like reviewer education, you know, it may be language, but I think it's more the reviewer education about what most is.
Well, with our few minutes left, if there are pressing questions from the list that we haven't gotten to, feel free to put something in the chat so that we make sure to address it. Otherwise, I'll highlight one more that was widely selected, which is, I have components that are adaptive. Does that mean I cannot test them in a 2 to the k factorial trial? So Linda, I'll let you speak to this one.
Okay.
First words out of Linda's mouth, it depends.
It depends, right. Sometimes, if you're optimizing an adaptive intervention, you need a SMART, sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. If you're interested in SMARTs, I recommend that you look at the website of the D3 Center at Michigan. They have a lot of great resources on their website, and we are starting to join forces. Cadio and the D3 Center are starting to join forces more and more. And eventually we'd like to get to a point for one-stop shopping for all that stuff, but we're a ways away from that. But the SMART is for situations where you have you're trying to compare different adaptation strategies. Now, sometimes you have a number of components, and each component, or maybe not even all the components, one or more of your components are adaptive, and you're not interested in looking at the success of the adaptation strategy or comparing different adaptation strategies. You just want to know whether this adaptation strategy is effective or not. In that case, you can probably just use a 2 to the k factorial experiment where for example, with one of the factors, it would be including this component with this adaptation strategy versus not including it at all. That might be one of the components. I don't know, is that clear about what the distinction is? So again, it depends on exactly what your scientific questions are, of course, and you've heard all of us say that a million times, that you have to start with what exactly you want to learn by doing the experiment, and then from that, you can usually move pretty quickly to a selection of an experimental design. But I guess the message here is, don't necessarily think you need a SMART or an MRT. Depending on what your questions are, sometimes a good old fashioned 2 to the k factorial experiment is sufficient.
Just, sorry to curtail that point, but Carly's got a great question, I think.
Yeah, I'll read it. Carly says, I'm about to start preparing a grant application for an evaluation phase experiment as I'm wrapping up completion of my optimization trial. Curious if you have thoughts on any of the common pitfalls you've seen as people move from the optimization to evaluation phases.
There haven't been that many sort of follow-on evaluation phases. I'm glad to hear you. There have been some. I'm glad to hear that you're doing that. So if you're interested, I don't know whether you, Carly, whether you know, there's 2 articles I would refer you to. One of them is Piper et al. In Annals of Behavioral Medicine, where she reports on an evaluation of a previously optimized intervention. And then, who was the first?
Tanner.
Yeah, Tanner et al. In, what was the journal?
Okay, it's Tanner et al. 2021 Translational Behavioral Medicine.
Okay, all right, yeah. So that's another one. And one thing that was interesting about that TBM article is that we actually, now this might be more avant-garde than you want to get, Carly, and you're not afraid of avant-garde, I know. And this doesn't always work, but in that article, the one in TBM, we actually conducted a hybrid evaluation optimization trial. So the evaluation was one factor in the factorial experiment. Now that was just a 2x2, and we had, so just to quickly explain what was going on there, we had done the optimization trial, we knew what components we wanted to include in the intervention, but then another component emerged that the people who were interested in the intervention really wanted to include, and we didn't want to include a component without testing it. So we cooked up this hybrid approach, and it works if you want to look at more components to add to the intervention. It doesn't work to swap them out, but if you want to add them, so you could potentially do 2 to the 4th or 2 to the 5th experiment, where one of the factors is the evaluation of the previously optimized treatment package, and then you would be able to look at 3 or 4 other components. So I'll just throw that out as something for you to think about. That might make the reviewers' heads explode. I don't know.
I don't mean to sound like a nerd, but that's pretty freaking cool. So
It is.
You got me pretty hyped about that. So
Yeah.
thank you. That's super cool.
Yeah, so take a look at the Tanner et al. Article, which, as I said, was only a 2x2. So there's, I mean, if I could do that all over again, I would have made that a larger experiment with more factors. But we had to kind of make that decision at the last minute because all of a sudden they're like, oh, we have to have sexual victimization in there. And we had a sexual, my collaborators quickly developed sexual victimization component, but we didn't have time to develop any additional components to test out. But anyway, that's a way to keep things moving.
Yeah.
And it's exciting. I'm with you, Carly.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is really helpful. If anyone has other thoughts about that at any time, please always email me. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, it looks like we're at about time, but I'll conclude by noting that Matt also has another great question about examples of participatory processes in MOST. So in particular, letting community partners or policymakers or organizational partners drive the question and what they want to learn. And I'll say at this closing, that we should, Kate said this, we should have a webinar about that.
Yes.
That goes into a lot of detail. So thank you very much for that, Jen. It sounds like you're interested.
Awesome. Thanks
Thanks
for
so
the
much,
feedback.
everybody, for joining us.
Okay, we'll do this again.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Bye-bye.